Have you ever noticed that in Spanish we use both respeto and respecto? The latter we use in set expressions like con respecto a, for example, con respecto a la situación actual, and the former for most daily contexts. For example, if I were to say, te tengo mucho respeto. It's admittedly curious, but it is but one of many examples of how Spanish adopts learned words, the so-called palabras doctas. And it's not only Spanish that does this. In fact, in this video, I want to look at how Spanish has changed its palabras doctas over time, but also how Portuguese has done so. So stick around for an interesting comparative video on Ibero-Romance palabras doctas, or palavras doutas. It's been a while since I mentioned the insuperable Francisco de Quevedo. And today, finally, after months since I mentioned him last, I finally have a bona fide, justifiable excuse to cite him. Look at these excerpts from some of his poems. This one comes from his Décimas, burlándose de todo estilo afectado. Here he talks about un circunloquio discreto en retruécano y conceto, como en calzas y en jubón. And in another poem, his satirical, ironic Poema heroico de las necedades y locuras de Orlando, we read this line, para el fin y el efecto que previenes. Efecto and conceto, very removed from our modern efecto and concepto. And it's not just Quevedo here. If we look throughout the corpus of his contemporaries, you'll see examples like this everywhere, from Góngora to Lope de Vega to Santa Teresa de Ávila. Perfecto we see instead of perfecto, seto instead of secto. And this isn't something that we can ascribe simply to a lack of standardized orthography for two reasons. One, this is early modern Spanish we're talking about. The orthography isn't that different from the orthography used today in modern formal Spanish. But secondly, because this is reflecting a genuine difference in pronunciation between antiquity and the so-called Siglo de Oro, and between those centuries, the 16th to 17th centuries, and modernity. What you may think is that this is a simple case of inherited forms versus palabras doctas, something we've spoken about in a video previously. According to that hypothesis, the conceto, the perfecto that we see in early modern texts is just the natural evolution of Latin effectus, perfectus, etc. And the versions that we have now are restored forms designed to closer mimic the original Latin orthography and pronunciation. However, the problem with that hypothesis is that many historical linguists, among them the acclaimed Rafael Lapesa, hypothesize that these words themselves, the words that we see in the early modern forms, perfecto, conceto, effetto, those were in fact at one point palabras doctas in their own right. They were likely introduced in Latinate form around the 13th century, and we know for a fact that in the numerous works ascribed to Alfonso el Sabio, that these words appear in original, more Latinate form. That is to say, we would see concepto, effecto, perfecto already in the 13th century. What really seems to have happened here is that medieval scholars, medieval writers, adopted and introduced these Latinate forms into medieval Castilian. And since their adoption in the what we might consider late Middle Ages, they've undergone the processes natural to Spanish phonetic evolution. We know, for example, that one of the features of Spanish evolution from Latin is the simplification of consonant clusters, especially consonant clusters in which one feature is plosive and the second is alveolar. For example, the Latin lacte for milk became leche in Spanish, septem became siete, and baptismum became modern bautismo. We've in fact examined this particular simplification in a previous video you can find on our channel if you would like more information there. But there are other consonant clusters that were also simplified. An excellent example I'm pulling up here is from the relatively unknown Caballero Venturoso by Juan Valladares de Valdelomar. In that work, we find this line, Hay leguas de mal camino, y el espíritu maligno en todas partes se ensaya. Now, that work was like the others looked at earlier, from the early modern period. And if we consult other works from the same time, we see that this malino is part of a broader pattern. Writers would say digno instead of digno, significo instead of significo, and my favorite, magnifico instead of magnifico. What this allows us to conclude is that this sound change, this elimination and simplification of consonant clusters, either postdates the early 13th century or was an ongoing phenomenon before, during, and after the lifetime of Alfonso X. In addition, and this is me more hypothesizing here, I suspect that it's not only due to sound change laws that we see this consonant cluster simplification in learned words, in palabras, doctas. I think analogy also plays a strong role, and semantic range as well. If you think about something like malino, seems like the perfect antonym to a term like divino, which didn't have a consonant cluster to eliminate in the first place. This analogy hypothesis of mine also makes a lot of sense if you consider that these palabras doctas would have been used often in rhyming verse, situations in which you want the phonetics of one word to rhyme and assimilate to the phonetics of other words. So much for this interesting story about how palabras doctas were introduced in the later Middle Ages and then conformed to Spanish sound change laws. But that, of course, raises the question, why do we not use these early modern forms today? Why do we say perfecto instead of perfetto? Why effecto instead of effetto? The answer lies, as with many efforts at standardization, what we might want to consider the dawn of modernity. In the 18th century, neoclassical intellectuals and philologists and lexicographers sought to rectify, and by that we mean artificially Latinize, a lot of Spanish vocabulary. And it's, as always, difficult to pinpoint exact individuals or even groups who were involved, but this was a broad trend associated both with institutions such as the foundation of the various royal academies across a lot of Europe, but also with important individuals and thinkers. In Spain, notably, thinkers like Benito Jerónimo Feijó or the very famous Gaspar Melchior de Jovenayos, often simply known as Jovenayos. Under the influence of these Enlightenment thinkers, dino became standardized as digno, effetto as effecto, and so on and so forth. As a side note, my favorite magnifico is probably one of the most successful examples of this, because not only did it reverse the consonant cluster simplification, it also reversed the Iberian Romance law that voices non-voiced intervocalic consonants. That you'll notice that in modern Spanish, magnifico reintroduces that vila k sound where there used to be a voiced g. This is the same law that explains why Spanish has lago when the original Latin was lacus. And as always, we've made a video about that as well on our channel if you'd like to check that out. We can't finish exploring the Spanish side of this story without looking at the exceptions, the instances in which the classicizing tendency actually didn't succeed. Not only did I mention at the beginning of the video that we still say respeto in commonplace everyday Spanish, but delito is still used instead of something like delicto, which is close to the original Latin delictum for a crime or a misdeed. When referring to a process of mourning, we still say luto in Spanish instead of something like lucto, which comes from the Latin luctuoso. A really obvious, everyday, even culinary example would be fruto or fruta, which comes from Latin fructus. Why these particular terms resisted classicization is not something that I could offer a concrete answer to, but my suspicion is that it might have something to do with semantic range and also psychological context. It's very easy to believe that sort of the intense psychological association with a word like luto might render that word particularly resistant to change, to official change. The everyday use of something like fruto might also resist the classicizing tendencies of our 18th century forebears. But if you have a more interesting, more convincing explanation, I'd be really keen to hear about it, so let me know in the comments below. Now, as I mentioned before, I don't want to leave this just at Spanish. I like to try and make interesting comparisons and contrasts here on this channel, and so immediately my eye turned to Portuguese while thinking up the script for this video. And I'm delighted to turn to Portuguese here because, well, that's a language that I don't speak particularly well. I'm still in the process of exploration, and researching this script actually introduced me to two amazing resources that I'd like to share with you. Before I do so, let's quickly look at how Portuguese treated the consonant clusters that we're concerned with here. And to keep things simple, we're just going to look at the k to consonant cluster, that vela alveolar consonant cluster. And the change is pretty straightforward. It's lenition and palatalization. That voiceless vela k sound is completely dropped and replaced by the palatalized vowel I. The Latin perfectus becomes Portuguese perfeito, effectus, effeito. Now, this seems like a pretty strange direction of sound change on paper, but if you pronounce those words and you ever so slightly soften the k sound, it's very easy to see how it almost completely gets elided. Say perfecto, and then soften that k. From perfecto, we might get perfecto. And in that second instance, it almost seems as though the word has completely disappeared. Maybe it won't even come across in the recording, but I can assure you that I attempted at least to pronounce it. The interesting thing about this sound change is that it develops a diphthong, and even a cursory examination of Portuguese vocabulary will indicate that this change is not restricted just to the lexical set of learned words that we've looked so far in this video. For example, the Latin noctem is noite in Portuguese, lactem late, and factum feito. But there's a subtle difficulty here. If we look at the Portuguese equivalent of the Spanish palabras doctas that we've looked at so far, one thing stands out clear as day. Spanish respeto is equivalent to Portuguese respeito, concepto, conceito, efecto, efeito, secto, seita. They retain this sound change. We don't see the restoration of classical forms here in these Portuguese words. And that leads me to a problem, a question that I wasn't entirely able to resolve. Is it possible that these words were never learned words, so-called palavras doutas in Portuguese? Please correct my pronunciation if I got that wrong. Or is it the case that these were palavras doutas, but Portugal just never experienced the classicizing force that the Spanish language does? In an attempt to resolve this, I came across two remarkable resources. The first is something that you lucky Portuguese speakers might be aware of already, the monumental, magnificent Dicionário Juez da Língua Portuguesa. Now, I'm not sure if I pronounced the surname of the esteemed linguist Antonio Juez correctly, so please correct me down in the comments below. I mean no disrespect either to him or the remarkable work he's carried out. There are other YouTubers who've made videos about how magnificent this dictionary is. It's a dictionary that provides not just definitions in the Portuguese language, but also comparative uses across the Lusophone world, and, interestingly enough, historical attestations and a degree of etymology as well. Unfortunately, I couldn't find this dicionário in any local library, so I went to access the rather impressive Corpus do Português, which unfortunately I am still struggling to use. The interface is not as clear as the excellent Spanish corde, but in time I will figure out how this tool uses, and you can expect more content diving into the lexical history of Portuguese. I'm super excited to try and do that because, as many of you know, I am consistently trying to work on my Portuguese. I'm going to leave this video there. It's already running long and I don't intend to test your patience. If you have any interesting comments about what I've said today or any corrections, let me know in the comments below. But until then, I will say muito obrigado, muchas gracias, and I hope to see you in the next video. Hasta luego y hasta logo.